The morning of March 23, 1944, 26,000 feet above Brunswick, Germany, Major Wilhelm Hackstatter, a Luftwaffe squadron commander with Jagdgeschwader 26, banks his Focke-Wulf 190 hard to the right and climbs toward the sun. Below him, stretching across the sky like a metallic thundercloud, flies the largest formation of American bombers he has ever seen. 336 B-17 Flying Fortresses arranged in perfect geometric precision, their aluminum skin glinting in the morning light. What Hackstatter witnesses next will haunt him for the rest of his life. Not because of the violence or the death, he's seen plenty of both since 1940, but because of what it means for Germany. For the first time in his 4 years of combat, he watches his entire squadron of 12 fighters make coordinated attack runs on the American formation, and not a single German fighter manages to break through to the bombers. Every approach is met with a wall of tracer fire so dense it looks like glowing rain falling upward. His wingman's aircraft disintegrates in midair, torn apart by concentrated fire from at least 6 bombers simultaneously. Another pilot simply vanishes in a ball of flame. By the time Hackstatter breaks off his attack and heads for home, 4 of his 12 fighters are gone, and they haven't shot down a single American bomber. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. That evening, in his after-action report to Luftwaffe High Command, Hackstatter will write words that would have seemed like treason just 6 months earlier. The American defensive system has become impenetrable. We're losing the air war. The transformation he witnessed, the evolution from scattered, vulnerable bomber formations to an interconnected defensive network that could destroy entire fighter squadrons, had taken the Americans less than 18 months to perfect. But the cost of that education had been paid in blood. Thousands of young Americans had died learning how to build what the Germans would eventually call the Wehrmachtpolk, the 4-engine herd, a formation so lethal that attacking it became synonymous with suicide among Luftwaffe pilots. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story begins not with tactical brilliance, but with catastrophic failure. October 14, 1943, the second raid on Schweinfurt. The 8th Air Force loses 60 B-17s in a single day, 600 men gone. The loss rate is so severe the deep penetration bombing missions are suspended indefinitely. In the officers' club at Thor Cabot's that night, Colonel Harry Mumford of the 100th Bomb Group sits alone, staring at a glass of whiskey he won't drink. His group has lost 13 aircraft. 130 men. Some of them he knew personally. Most were kids who'd been in England less than 3 months. The mathematics of death are simple and merciless. At a 20% loss rate per mission, a crew has essentially no chance of surviving their required 25-mission tour. The bombing campaign is failing. Everyone knows it. The question is whether anyone in Washington or at 8th Air Force headquarters is willing to admit it. The American theory of daylight precision bombing had been built on a fundamental assumption that would prove dangerously naive. The planners believed that heavily armed bombers flying in formation could defend themselves against fighter attack without escort. The B-17 Flying Fortress, they argued, carried enough defensive armament to create overlapping fields of fire that would make fighter attacks prohibitively costly. Each B-17 mounted 13 50-caliber machine guns. Surely, the thinking went, dozens of these aircraft flying together could create an impenetrable defensive barrier. This assumption had been developed during peacetime exercises over the Nevada desert, where enemy fighters were American pilots following safety protocols, and nobody was actually trying to kill anyone. The theory had never been tested against experienced pilots defending their homeland. Pilots had been refining their tactics since 1939. The reality that confronted American bomber crews in 1943 was brutally different from the theory. The Luftwaffe had spent 4 years perfecting the art of bomber interception. German pilots had learned their trade against British Wellingtons, Soviet PE-2s, and Polish PZL-37s. They knew exactly how to exploit defensive weaknesses. They understood that bomber gunners, no matter how well trained, struggled to track fighters approaching at 400 miles per hour. They knew that the effective range of 50-caliber machine guns dropped dramatically when firing at crossing targets. Most importantly, they had discovered that American formations, when spread out for mutual support, actually created gaps in defensive coverage that could be exploited with surgical precision. Major Egon Mayer of Jagdgeschwader II had pioneered the head-on attack in November 1942. The tactic was devastatingly simple. Position your fighters 5 miles ahead of the bomber formation, climb 2,000 feet above their altitude, roll inverted, dive at full throttle, and aim directly for the lead bomber's nose. The closing speed would exceed 500 miles per hour. The bomber's forward armament in early B-17 models was limited to 2 handheld 50-caliber guns, operated by the Navigator and Bombardier. At this, these men could get off a few dozen rounds before the fighter was past them. Meanwhile, the German fighter carried 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns, all bore-sighted to converge at 300 meters. The pilot had a stable gun platform and a reflector gun sight. The bomber crew had handheld weapons they were trying to aim while their aircraft bucked in turbulence. The mathematics favored the attacker overwhelmingly.
But the head-on attack required exceptional skill and iron nerves. The pilot had perhaps 3 seconds to line up his shot, fire, and break away before collision. The margin for error was essentially 0. 1 second too late on the stick, and both aircraft would merge in a ball of flame at a combined speed of 500 miles per hour. German squadron commanders initially struggled to convince their pilots to attempt the maneuver. It went against every instinct of self-preservation. Yet by early 1943, it had become standard Luftwaffe doctrine because it worked. The kill rate was extraordinary. A skilled pilot could destroy a B-17 with a 2-second burst of concentrated fire into the cockpit and nose section. The Americans tried various countermeasures. They experimented with different formation patterns, trying to maximize defensive firepower while maintaining bombing accuracy. The early formations were disasters of compromise. The Javelin formation spread bombers across several miles of sky, which reduced losses to flak but made mutual defensive support impossible. The tucked-in formation brought aircraft closer together but created dangerous turbulence problems and increased the risk of mid-air collisions. Bombers flew into each other's prop wash, making formation flying exhausting and dangerous. Pilots fought their controls constantly, burning fuel at prodigious rates and arriving over targets already exhausted from hours of formation flying. The fundamental problem was that nobody had thought through the 3-dimensional geometry of aerial defense. The formations were designed in 2 dimensions, as if the bombers were ships sailing in line ahead. But air combat happens in 3 dimensions. Fighters don't just attack from the side or behind, they attack from above, below, and from every conceivable angle. The early American formations failed to account for this 3-dimensional reality. A formation that looked impressive from the side might have massive gaps in coverage from above or below. German pilots quickly learned to identify and exploit these gaps. The loss statistics from the summer and fall of 1943 tell the story with brutal clarity. The mission to Regensburg and Schweinfurt on August 17th cost 60 aircraft. The mission to Münster on October 10th cost 30 bombers. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14th, forever known as Black Thursday, cost 60 B-17s, with another 17 written off due to battle damage. In 3 missions, the 8th Air Force had lost 150 heavy bombers and approximately 1,500 highly trained aircrew. At this rate of attrition, the entire strategic bombing campaign would collapse within months. It was into this crisis that Colonel Curtis LeMay of the 305th Bomb Group had been developing his revolutionary solution since late 1942. LeMay was not a popular commander. He was harsh, demanding, and seemingly devoid of human warmth. His own staff called him Iron Ass behind his back. But LeMay possessed something more valuable than popularity. He had an engineer's mind that could see patterns where others saw only chaos. He spent hours studying after-action reports, analyzing the position of every aircraft lost, the angle of every fighter attack, the effectiveness of every defensive gun position. What he discovered would transform American bombing doctrine. LeMay realized that the problem wasn't the defensive firepower of individual bombers. The B-17 carried more than adequate armament. The problem was that the existing formations prevented these weapons from providing mutual support. When bombers flew 200 yards apart, their 50-caliber guns couldn't effectively cover each other. Each aircraft fought alone, surrounded by friends who couldn't help them. It was like having a dozen bodyguards who weren't allowed to get close enough to actually protect you. LeMay's solution was radical in its simplicity. Stack the bombers in 3 dimensions, not 2. Create a box of aircraft with vertical as well as horizontal spacing. Position them so that every bomber's guns could cover multiple other aircraft simultaneously. Transform the formation from a collection of individual aircraft into a single integrated weapons system. The combat box that LeMay developed placed 18 to 21 bombers in a 3-dimensional formation roughly 600 feet tall, 800 feet deep, and 2,000 feet wide. The lead squadron flew in the middle. The high squadron positioned itself 1,000 feet above and slightly behind, offset to one side. The low squadron flew 1,000 feet below and behind, offset to the opposite side. Within each squadron, individual aircraft maintained spacing of less than 75 feet. Wingtip to wingtip, they flew so close that pilots could see each other's facial expressions. The formation required extraordinary flying skill. Pilots had to maintain exact position for hours while flying through turbulence, prop wash, and the shock waves from anti-aircraft explosions. The physical demands were extreme. B-17 controls were not power-assisted. Every input required significant physical force. After 6 hours of formation flying at altitude, pilots could barely move their arms. But the defensive advantages were undeniable. A fighter attacking from any angle now faced concentrated fire from multiple bombers. A head-on attack exposed the fighter to fire from the lead squadron's nose guns, the high squadron's belly turrets, and the low squadron's top turrets. A beam attack from the side brought fire from waist gunners on multiple aircraft, plus crossing fire from turrets on bombers above and below. The tail attack, traditionally the fighter's favorite approach, now meant flying through the concentrated fire of dozens of tail guns, all bore-sided to converge at 600 yards. German pilots immediately noticed the difference. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke of Jagdgeschwaden 11 recorded in his diary after encountering one of the first combat box formations. The Americans have learned something new. Their formations are much tighter, almost touching. When we attacked, the defensive fire was overwhelming. Every approach angle was covered by multiple bombers. We lost 3 aircraft and barely damaged any bombers. This is not sustainable. The combat box solved the defensive problem, but it created new challenges. The tight spacing made the formation vulnerable to flak. German anti-aircraft batteries could now be certain that shells exploding anywhere within the formation would likely damage multiple aircraft. The formation also required exceptional discipline. If one pilot drifted out of position, he created a gap that German fighters would immediately exploit. Worse, his movement might cause other aircraft to adjust their positions, creating a cascade of errors that could destroy the entire formation's integrity.
The physical and psychological demands on crews were extreme. Ball turret gunners spent entire missions curled in fetal positions in their spherical turrets, unable to wear parachutes due to space constraints. If the aircraft was going down, they had to rotate the turret to align the hatch, climb back into the fuselage, find their parachute, and bail out, all while the bomber was potentially spinning or on fire. Waist gunners stood at open windows in sub-zero temperatures, fighting frostbite while trying to track fighters moving at 400 miles per hour. Radio operators monitored communications while manning their guns, switching between radios and weapons as the situation demanded. The combat box's effectiveness became clear during the brutal air battles of early 1944. On January 11th, the 8th Air Force sent 663 heavy bombers to attack German aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe responded with everything available, but the tight American formations proved nearly impenetrable. German after-action reports described the frustration of trying to break through the defensive fire. Pilots who pressed their attacks were shot down. Those who broke off early accomplished nothing. The Americans lost 60 bombers that day, still a significant loss, but far better than the catastrophic attrition rates of the previous fall. More importantly, they destroyed or damaged significant portions of German aircraft production capability. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Luftwaffe's response to the combat box revealed the desperation of their situation. They began deploying increasingly radical weapons and tactics. The Werfer 21 rocket was a 21-centimeter unguided rocket launched from underwing tubes. Twin-engine fighters like the Messerschmitt 110 would position themselves outside the range of American defensive guns and launch salvos of rockets into the bomber formations. The rockets were wildly inaccurate, but their psychological effect was significant. Bomber crews watched these massive projectiles streaming toward them, trailing smoke, knowing there was no way to evade or shoot them down. Some German units experimented with aerial bombing of the formations. Fighters would climb above the bombers and drop bombs into the formation, hoping to score hits through pure chance. Other units tried cable trailing attacks, dragging cables with explosive charges through the formations. The Sturmgruppe tactics involved heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190s approaching in tight formation, absorbing defensive fire until they reached point-blank range. These suicide tactics reflected the Luftwaffe's growing desperation. They were willing to accept massive fighter losses for the chance to break up American formations. The German pilots' experience attacking a combat box was terrifying. Oberlieutenant Franz Stigler, a veteran with over 400 combat missions, described it years later. You would see the formation ahead, this massive block of aircraft bristling with guns. As you approached, you'd see the muzzle flashes start, little lights flickering all over the formation. Then the tracers would come, hundreds of them, all converging on your aircraft. The air would be full of red streaks. You could actually hear the bullets passing, a continuous crackling like static. You had to fly through that wall of fire, hold your course, aim, shoot, and get out. Many pilots simply couldn't do it. They would break off early, fire from too far away, accomplish nothing. The psychological impact on bomber crews was equally intense but different. They found strength in the formation itself. Sergeant Robert Morgan, pilot of the famous Memphis Belle, explained it simply. When you were in formation, tight formation, you weren't alone. You could look left and right and see other bombers right there with you. Their guns were protecting you, your guns were protecting them. It was the only thing that made it bearable, knowing you were all in it together. The combat box reached its ultimate expression in the 1,000-bomber raids of 1944. On February 20th, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, known as Big Week. For 6 consecutive days, over 1,000 bombers attacked German aircraft production facilities. The formation stretched for hundreds of miles. From the ground, German civilians described the sky turning dark with aircraft. The sound was overwhelming, thousands of engines creating a continuous thunder that could be heard from 50 miles away. German fighters attempting to attack these massive formations faced a seemingly impossible task. The defensive fire was so concentrated that traditional tactics became suicidal. The Luftwaffe developed increasingly desperate counters. The Ramjager fighters, or ramming fighters, were pilots who volunteered to ram American bombers after expending their ammunition. The pilots were supposed to bail out after the collision, but survival rates were low. The fact that the Luftwaffe was reduced to ramming attacks showed how effective the combat box had become. When your only viable tactic is to deliberately crash into the enemy, you've effectively admitted tactical defeat. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing the attrition battle catastrophically. They were losing experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements. New pilots with less than 50 hours of combat training were being thrown into battle against American formations defended by hundreds of machine guns. The results were predictable. German loss rates in some missions exceeded 30%. No air force could sustain such losses. It was during this period that Major Wilhelm Hackstatter had his encounter over Brunswick that would lead to his devastating report to Luftwaffe High Command. Hackstatter was not a defeatist. He held the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of Germany's highest military honors. He had 96 confirmed aerial victories. But he was also a realist. After watching his squadron get torn apart attacking a combat box formation, he knew the air war was lost. His report, preserved in Luftwaffe archives, is remarkable for its blunt honesty. The American formations have evolved to a point where successful attack is nearly impossible. They fly in boxes of 54 aircraft, each box supporting the others with defensive fire. The boxes are stacked vertically and horizontally to create overlapping fields of fire that extend for miles. Our pilots face continuous defensive fire from the moment they enter gun range until they break away. We are losing 3 or 4 fighters for every bomber destroyed. This exchange rate is unsustainable. Unless we develop new tactics or weapons, we cannot stop the American bombers.
Hackstatter's report was not unique. Similar assessments were arriving from fighter units across Germany. Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, himself a decorated fighter ace, wrote in his memoir that by spring 1944, attacking American combat boxes had become, quote, a form of aerial suicide. The defensive firepower was so overwhelming that even the most experienced pilots struggled to press home attacks. Young pilots, fresh from abbreviated training programs, simply couldn't do it. They would approach the formations, see the wall of tracer fire, and break away without accomplishing anything. The numbers support these first-hand accounts. In 1943, before the full implementation of the combat box, the Luftwaffe was shooting down American bombers at a ratio of roughly 1 German fighter lost for every 2 bombers destroyed. By mid-1944, that ratio had reversed. The Americans were destroying 2 or 3 German fighters for every bomber lost. The combat box, combined with improved aircraft like the B-17G with its chin turret, had transformed the daylight bombing campaign from a desperate gamble into a winning strategy. The human cost remained staggering. Even with the improved formations, bombing missions over Germany were extraordinarily dangerous. The 8th Air Force would eventually suffer over 47,000 casualties, including over 26,000 killed in action. These were young men, average age 23, who climbed into aluminum aircraft and flew into the most heavily defended airspace in the world. They did it repeatedly, mission after mission, knowing the odds. Technical Sergeant William Lawley Jr., a B-17 pilot with the 305th Bomb Group, flew one of the most remarkable missions, illustrating both the effectiveness and the limitations of the combat box. On February 20, 1944, during a mission to Leipzig, Lawley's aircraft was hit by fighters just after bombing the target. The co-pilot was killed instantly. Lawley was severely wounded with a shell fragment in his face. The aircraft lost an engine and began falling out of formation. This was the combat box's ultimate weakness. Once an aircraft left the formation's protective umbrella, it was doomed. German fighters immediately swarmed Lawley's bomber. In the next few minutes, the B-17 was hit by dozens of cannon shells. Another engine failed. The bombardier's arm was nearly severed. The tail gunner was killed. But Lawley refused to abandon the aircraft because several wounded crewmen couldn't bail out. He flew the crippled bomber 800 miles back to England on 2 engines, fighting off fighter attacks, maintaining consciousness despite massive blood loss. 8 of his crew survived because of his actions. He received the Medal of Honor. Lawley's story illustrates a crucial point often lost in discussions of tactics and technology. The combat box worked not because of its geometric perfection or the mathematics of overlapping fields of fire. It worked because thousands of young men had the discipline and courage to execute it under the most extreme conditions imaginable. They held formation while friends died beside them. They maintained position while flak burst around them. They stayed in their assigned spots while every instinct screamed at them to run. The spring of 1944 marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe. The appearance of long-range American fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, meant that bombers no longer relied solely on their defensive formations for protection. But even with fighter escort, the combat box remained essential. It concentrated bombing accuracy, provided mutual support during the bomb run when fighters had to stand off, and gave crews the psychological strength that came from fighting as a unit rather than alone. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe could barely mount token resistance to American bombing raids. The great fighter force that had dominated European skies from 1939 to 1943 had been ground down through systematic attrition. The combat box had played a central role in that victory. It had given American bombers the defensive capability to survive long enough for long-range escorts to arrive. It had forced German fighters to accept unfavorable exchange rates that bled them white. Most importantly, it had proven that daylight precision bombing could work, that specific targets could be systematically destroyed despite the best efforts of the defense. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland would later write about the combat box with professional admiration mixed with frustration. The Americans solved the defensive problem through engineering and discipline. They took aircraft that were individually vulnerable and created formations that were collectively almost impregnable. We could still shoot down bombers, but the cost became prohibitive. For every bomber we destroyed, we lost fighters and pilots we couldn't replace. The arithmetic was remorseless. They could build bombers and train crews faster than we could shoot them down. Once they achieved that equation, the war was effectively over. The last major Luftwaffe attempt to contest American bombing operations came on November 2, 1944, during a raid on Merseburg. The Germans assembled approximately 400 fighters, virtually their entire remaining strength, for one massive coordinated attack. They employed every tactic developed over 2 years of fighting combat boxes, rockets, heavy cannon, company front attacks with 30 or 40 fighters simultaneously. The result was anticlimax. The American formations, now refined through 2 years of combat, supported by hundreds of escort fighters and manned by thoroughly trained crews, absorbed the attack and continued to the target. 26 bombers were lost, but 40 German fighters were destroyed. The Luftwaffe never again mounted a maximum effort against American bombers. In the final months of the war, American bombing operations over Germany resembled training exercises more than combat missions. 1,000-bomber raids proceeded to targets with minimal opposition. German cities and industrial facilities were systematically destroyed. The Luftwaffe, which had once been the terror of European skies, could only watch. Young German pilots, some with less than 20 hours in their aircraft, were ordered not to engage American formations. There was no point. The combat box had evolved to such perfection, and American quantitative superiority had grown so overwhelming that resistance was futile. The story comes full circle in April 1945. Major Wilhelm Hackstatter, the same officer who had written so pessimistically about American formations a year earlier, was captured after his airfield was overrun by advancing American troops. During his interrogation, he was asked about German defensive tactics against bomber formations. His answer, recorded in the interrogation transcript, was simple. By the end, we had no tactics. Your formations were too strong, too well coordinated. We told our pilots to avoid them, to look for stragglers only. Attacking a combat box formation was suicide. We knew it,
You knew it. The air war was over. The spring of 1945 brought a surreal quality to the air war over Germany. Lieutenant Colonel John Bennett, leading the 401st Bomb Group on a mission to Munich, recorded in his diary, "We flew over Germany today like we owned it. Because we do. 300 fortresses in perfect formation, not a single enemy fighter appeared. Below us, the country that once boasted the world's most formidable air force could only watch as we passed overhead. The gunners had nothing to do but scan empty skies. But this dominance had been purchased through innovation, adaptation, and sacrifice on a scale that defies comprehension. The combat box formation, which seems so obvious in retrospect, had required 18 months of bloody trial and error to perfect. Each refinement had been written in the blood of young airmen who died learning what didn't work. The final version of the formation, the one that broke the Luftwaffe's back, incorporated lessons from hundreds of missions and thousands of individual combat experiences. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The evolution hadn't stopped with LeMay's basic design. By late 1944, the Americans had developed the combat wing formation, linking multiple combat boxes into an even larger defensive system. 3 combat boxes would fly in trail, separated by about 3 miles, but positioned so their defensive firepower overlapped. A fighter attacking any single box would face fire not just from that formation, but from the boxes ahead and behind. The geometry was precise, calculated to maximize mutual support while minimizing the risk of friendly fire. From the German perspective, attacking a combat wing meant facing defensive fire from potentially 150 heavy bombers simultaneously. The psychological warfare aspect of these massive formations cannot be understated. Luftwaffe pilot Heinrich Bartels, interviewed after the war, described the experience. You would climb to intercept altitude and see them coming. First, the condensation trails, hundreds of them, like white fingers stretching across the sky. Then the formations themselves would emerge from the haze, box after box after box, stretching to the horizon. The sound would hit you next, a deep rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was like watching an avalanche coming toward you. You knew you were supposed to attack, but your mind couldn't process how. Where do you even begin against something like that? The Americans had also perfected the choreography of the bomb run itself. The combat box's defensive strength actually increased during the most vulnerable phase of the mission. As formations approached the target, they would compress, reducing spacing between aircraft to maximize defensive firepower during the straight and level bomb run, when evasive maneuvering was impossible. This tucked-in formation was exhausting to fly, with pilots fighting prop wash and turbulence continuously, but it created overlapping fields of fire so dense that German fighters compared it to flying into a steel storm. The bomb run lasted approximately 3 to 5 minutes, but for the crews it felt like hours. They had to fly straight and level, no evasive action allowed, while flak burst around them and fighters potentially attacked. The bombardier took control of the aircraft through the Norden bomb site's autopilot connection. The pilot's job was simply to hold formation and pray. Ball turret gunner William Harmon described it. Those minutes over the target were the worst. You're hanging in space in this glass bubble, watching the flak bursts walk toward you, black puffs getting closer and closer. You can't do anything about it. The plane isn't maneuvering. You just hang there and wait to see if today's the day you die. The statistics from this period revealed the transformation in American bombing effectiveness. In 1933, only about 20% of bombs dropped hit within 1,000 feet of their intended targets. By early 1945, flying in tight combat box formations with improved bomb sights and techniques, accuracy had improved to nearly 45% within 1,000 feet. This might not sound impressive by modern standards, but it represented a revolutionary improvement in precision bombing. Specific buildings within factory complexes could now be targeted and destroyed. Railroad marshalling yards could be systematically eliminated. Oil refineries could be reduced to twisted metal with surgical precision. The human dynamics within these formations were complex and fascinating. Each combat box developed its own personality, its own reputation. The 100th Bomb Group became known as the Bloody 100 for their heavy losses, though statistically, their casualties were no worse than average. The psychological burden of this reputation affected crew morale and performance. New crews assigned to the 100th often arrived already convinced that they were doomed, a self-fulfilling prophecy that may have contributed to operational errors. The 91st Bomb Group, by contrast, developed a reputation for exceptional formation flying. Their combat boxes were so tight, so perfectly maintained, that German fighters specifically avoided them when other targets were available. This reputation became a protective shield. Luftwaffe intelligence briefings actually identified certain American groups as hard targets to be avoided unless absolutely necessary. The precision of formation flying had become a weapon in itself.
The physical demands on crews intensified as formations grew larger and missions longer. A typical mission to Berlin meant 10 hours in the air, 7 of those in tight formation. Pilots lost an average of 5 pounds per mission from physical exertion. They flew in electrically heated suits that frequently malfunctioned, leaving them to choose between frostbite and exhaustion from shivering. Oxygen systems failed regularly at altitude, causing crew members to pass out. There are documented cases of gunners found frozen to death at their positions, having died from anoxia when their oxygen systems failed, their bodies remaining upright, hands still on their weapons. The combat box also created unique command challenges. Formation leaders carried enormous responsibility. Their decisions affected hundreds of aircraft and thousands of lives. Colonel Frank Hunter, leading a particularly difficult mission to Regensburg, had to make a critical decision when weather closed in over the target. He could abort, sending 200 aircraft home with their bomb loads, wasting thousands of gallons of fuel and destroying crew morale. Or he could press on, risking mid-air collisions in the clouds. He pressed on. 3 aircraft collided in the overcast, 30 men died, but the mission succeeded. Hunter never flew another combat mission, destroyed by the weight of command responsibility. The Germans, meanwhile, were developing increasingly desperate counters to the combat box. The Mest 163 Comet rocket fighter could climb to bomber altitude in less than 3 minutes and attack at speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. But its endurance was measured in minutes, not hours. Pilots had 1, perhaps 2 passes at a formation before their fuel was exhausted. The Mest 262 jet fighter was more practical, but arrived too late and in too few numbers. Even these revolutionary aircraft struggled against the combat box. Their high speeds made accurate shooting difficult, and they still faced the concentrated defensive fire of dozens of bombers. One of the most remarkable aspects of the combat box's success was its psychological impact on German civilian morale. The sight of hundreds of American bombers flying in perfect formation, seemingly impervious to defense, broadcast a message more powerful than any propaganda. The war was lost. Everyone could see it written across the sky in condensation trails. German civilian Rudolf Speer recalled, "We would stand in our gardens and watch them fly over, these enormous formations, so precise, so ordered. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. We knew then that all the victory announcements on the radio were lies. You cannot argue with what your own eyes see." The perfection of the combat box coincided with another crucial development, the improvement of crew training. By 1944, American bomber crews were arriving in England with over 300 hours of flight training, including extensive formation flying practice. They had practiced emergency procedures until they were automatic. Gunners had fired thousands of practice rounds. This training showed in combat effectiveness. A 1944 crew was exponentially more effective than their 1943 counterparts, not because they were braver, but because they were better prepared. The contrast with German pilot training was stark. By 1944, German fighter pilots were entering combat with less than 50 hours total flying time. They had fired perhaps 100 practice rounds. Their formation flying was rudimentary. When they encountered American combat boxes manned by thoroughly trained crews, the results were predictable. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a systematic execution. The story of Technical Sergeant Forrest Vossler exemplifies the human dimension of the combat box's effectiveness. On December 20, 1943, Vossler was the radio operator on a B-17 attacking Bremen. German fighters concentrated on his aircraft trying to drive it from formation. Vossler was hit by a 20mm shell that destroyed his radio equipment and sent metal fragments into both his eyes. Partially blinded and severely wounded, he repaired his radio by touch, enabling his pilot to receive formation instructions and fighter warnings. When the tail gunner was wounded, Vossler crawled to the tail position and manned the guns, fighting by sound and muzzle flashes he could barely see. His actions kept the aircraft in formation long enough to reach the protective umbrella of other bombers. He received the Medal of Honor. Stories like Vossler's were not uncommon. The combat box demanded and received extraordinary heroism from ordinary men. Gunners stayed at their positions with broken bones and severe wounds because they knew their firepower was essential to the formation's integrity. Pilots flew with wounds that should have incapacitated them because breaking formation meant certain death for their crews. The formation created a code of mutual dependence that transcended individual survival instincts. By January 1945, the 8th Air Force could put over 2,000 heavy bombers into the air on a single day. These aircraft flew in approximately 40 combat boxes, each a self-contained defensive system, all coordinated to arrive at different targets at precise times. The choreography required was staggering. Aircraft took off from dozens of airfields across England, formed up over specific assembly points, joined into combat boxes, then combat wings, then flew precise routes to targets deep in Germany. The fact that this was accomplished routinely, day after day, in weather conditions that would ground modern airlines using 1940s technology defies belief. The final validation of the combat box came from an unexpected source. In March 1945, General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland was secretly tasked with forming a squadron of Germany's best surviving fighter pilots, flying the new Me-262 jet fighter. This unit, Jagdverband 44, represented Germany's last hope of contesting American air superiority. Galland, with decades of combat experience and access to revolutionary technology, studied the problem of attacking combat boxes intensively. His conclusion, found in captured documents, was devastating. Even with jet fighters and our most experienced pilots, the American defensive formations cannot be successfully attacked without prohibitive losses. The combination of formation integrity, defensive firepower, and escort fighters has created an aerial fortress system that cannot be breached with available forces. The human cost of perfecting the combat box was staggering. The 8th Air Force alone suffered over 26,000 killed in action and 28,000 wounded. The 100th Bomb Group, operational for less than 2 years, lost 229 aircraft and over 2,000 aircrew killed or missing. These numbers represent individual tragedies multiplied thousands of times. Young men who would never return home, families destroyed, futures erased. The combat box was a tactical triumph built on strategic sacrifice. Yet the veterans, when interviewed decades later, spoke of the formation with something approaching reverence. It had saved their lives. Navigator William Thomas explained, "That formation was everything. It was your protection, your purpose, your family up there. When you were tucked in tight, when everyone was where they were supposed to be, you felt like you could make it. When the formation was ragged, when gaps appeared, you knew men were going to die. We lived or died as a unit, not as individuals." The combat box's influence extended far beyond World War II. The concept of mutual support through geometric positioning influenced military aviation doctrine for decades. The principle that individually vulnerable units could create collectively strong formations through disciplined positioning became fundamental to military thinking.
Even in the age of guided missiles and stealth technology, the basic concept LeMay pioneered, that formation geometry could multiply defensive capability, remains relevant. The last American heavy bomber mission over Europe flew on April 25, 1945. 400 B-17s attacked railway targets in Czechoslovakia. They flew in perfect combat box formations, encountered no fighter opposition, and lost no aircraft. It was a demonstration of absolute air supremacy, achieved through tactical innovation and purchased with blood. The men who flew that mission knew they were witnessing history. The combat box, born from disaster in 1943, refined through terrible casualties in 1944, had achieved its ultimate purpose. It had proven that democratic nations could match and exceed the military innovations of totalitarian regimes, that American industrial might, coupled with tactical adaptation, could overcome any defense. In May 1945, thousands of American bomber crews began returning home. They had survived the most dangerous sustained military campaign in American history. The combat box had been their shield and sword. It had transformed them from easy targets into an unstoppable force. They had entered the war flying in loose gaggles, vulnerable and afraid. They finished it in perfect geometric formations that ruled the skies absolutely. The last word belongs to Colonel Frank Armstrong, who led some of the first combat box missions. People ask me about the secret of our success. There was no secret. It was geometry and guts. We figured out the right way to position our aircraft, and then thousands of young Americans had the courage to fly those positions while being shot at. The combat box was just aluminum and machine guns arranged in a pattern. What made it work was the men inside those aluminum shells holding formation no matter what. They were ordinary kids who did an extraordinary thing. They held the line in the sky when everything depended on it. The legacy of the combat box extends beyond military history. It represents American innovation under pressure, the ability to learn from failure, adapt tactics, and overcome through systematic improvement. It proves that technological superiority alone doesn't win wars. The Germans had better fighters, better pilots initially, better tactics. But the Americans had the ability to learn, to adapt, and to implement solutions on a massive scale. The combat box was democracy in action. Thousands of individuals working in precise coordination to achieve a common goal. Today, the few surviving veterans of the bombing campaign are in their late 90s or older. When they speak of their service, they invariably mention the formation. It defined their war experience. It was the thing that kept them alive, the discipline that gave meaning to the chaos, the geometry that transformed fear into purpose. The combat box was more than a tactical innovation. It was a covenant between men who agreed to live or die together, maintaining their position in the sky no matter the cost, because they understood that their survival depended not on individual skill, but on collective discipline. The skies over Europe have been peaceful for nearly 80 years now. The condensation trails that cross the continent today belong to commercial airliners, not bomber formations. But the legacy of the combat box remains, written in the history of aerial warfare, proven in the arithmetic of victory, and remembered in the hearts of the men who flew those perfect, deadly formations through the most dangerous skies in history. The perfection of the combat box created ripple effects that transformed every aspect of the air war. Ground crews, those unsung heroes who kept the bombers flying, had to adapt their entire maintenance philosophy. A single aircraft with mechanical problems could destroy an entire formation's integrity. Chief Mechanic Sergeant Anthony Toretti of the 379th Bomb Group explained the pressure. If one of our ships couldn't maintain formation because of engine problems, it wasn't just that plane at risk, it was every plane around it. We worked 18-hour shifts to ensure every fortress could hold its position. A fouled spark plug could kill 10 crews if it caused a plane to fall out of formation. The maintenance statistics from 1944 reveal this dedication. The average B-17 required 4.2 hours of maintenance for every hour of flight time. For a 10-hour mission to Berlin, that meant 42 hours of work by dozens of specialists.
Multiply that by the 1,000 bombers participating in major raids, and the scale becomes staggering. Over 100,000 ground personnel in England existed solely to keep the combat boxes flying. They worked in freezing hangars, often on aircraft riddled with battle damage, racing against time to have maximum aircraft available for the next mission. The weather factor added another layer of complexity that tested the combat box to its limits. Formation flying in clear skies was challenging enough. Formation flying through clouds, in icing conditions, with zero visibility, was nearly impossible. Yet it was routinely accomplished. The instrument flying required was extraordinary. Pilots had to maintain exact airspeed, altitude, and heading while flying solely by reference to instruments, trusting that dozens of other aircraft were doing exactly the same thing just feet away, invisible in the clouds. January 11, 1944, demonstrated this challenge catastrophically. The 445th Bomb Group entered a massive cloud bank while forming up over England. In the soup, spatial disorientation set in. Aircraft emerged from the clouds scattered across 50 miles of sky. Some were inverted, some in steep dives, many completely lost. It took 2 hours to reform, burning precious fuel. 8 aircraft had to abort the mission. 2 collided in the clouds, killing 20 men before they even left English airspace. Yet the mission continued. The combat box demanded such sacrifices. The navigational challenges of maintaining formation integrity across hundreds of miles were solved through remarkable innovation. The lead navigator in each combat box became one of the most important men in the formation. He had to account for wind drift, magnetic variation, combat damage affecting airspeed, and the cumulative navigational errors of flying in formation. A 2-degree error over a 600-mile route would put the formation 30 miles off target. In the pre-GPS era, using only dead reckoning, radio beacons when available, and celestial navigation when visible, these navigators routinely brought their formations to specific buildings in specific cities. Lieutenant David McCarthy, lead navigator for the 384th Bomb Group, developed a technique called offset navigation that became standard procedure. Instead of flying directly to heavily defended targets, he would navigate to a clearly identifiable landmark offset from the target, then make a precise turn at a calculated point. This prevented German fighters from anticipating the target based on the formation's heading. It required split-second timing and perfect coordination among dozens of aircraft, but it worked. German defenders repeatedly complained that American formations would appear over targets from unexpected directions, reducing warning time and defensive preparation. The combat box also revolutionized aerial gunnery. The pre-war theory assumed that aerial gunners would engage individual targets with aimed fire. The reality of the combat box was completely different. Gunners learned to create zones of fire, laying down continuous streams of bullets in assigned sectors, knowing that German fighters had to fly through these zones to attack. It wasn't marksmanship in the traditional sense, but rather the creation of an aerial minefield of lead. Staff Sergeant John Gillespie, a top turret gunner with 50 missions, described the evolution. Early on, we tried to aim at specific fighters, lead them like hunting ducks. Waste of ammunition. By 44, we'd learned to create walls of fire. My job wasn't to shoot down fighters, but to make certain pieces of sky uninhabitable. If every gunner did their job, there was no safe approach to our formation. The Germans had to fly through somebody's field of fire to get to us. This systematic approach to aerial gunnery required precise ammunition management. Each bomber carried approximately 11,000 rounds of .5 caliber ammunition. That sounds like a lot, but distributed among 10 guns over a 6-hour mission, it meant disciplined fire control. Gunners who burned through their ammunition early left gaps in the defensive pattern. The combat box only worked if everyone could maintain defensive fire throughout the mission. The psychological warfare aspect extended to elaborate deception operations.
The Americans learned to create ghost formations using aluminum chaff and electronic jammers. A small group of aircraft could simulate the radar signature of an entire combat box, drawing German fighters away from real formations. These deception missions were extraordinarily dangerous. The aircraft involved had to maintain the illusion long enough to be believable, often drawing concentrated fighter attacks they couldn't adequately defend against. The combat box's success created unexpected problems for German civilians. The concentrated formations meant that bomb patterns were much tighter than earlier scattered raids. Entire city districts would be obliterated in minutes rather than damaged over hours. The psychological impact was devastating. Elsa Wendell, Hamburg resident, wrote in her diary, "The old raids were terrible but survivable. You could run from area to area as bombs fell. Now when the Americans come in their boxes, entire neighborhoods simply cease to exist in an instant. There is no running. There is only luck."
The formation also created unique medical challenges. Flight surgeons discovered that the stress of formation flying was literally killing aircrew through cardiovascular strain. Heart rates during combat missions routinely exceeded 160 beats per minute for hours. The combination of altitude, cold, physical exertion, and combat stress created a perfect storm of physiological challenges. Men in their early 20s were suffering heart attacks, strokes, and psychological breakdowns at rates typically seen in men 3 times their age. Major Harold Bowman, chief flight surgeon for the 8th Air Force, instituted revolutionary combat fatigue protocols. Crews showing signs of excessive stress were rotated to training duties rather than being stigmatized as cowards. This enlightened approach, radical for its time, recognized that the human body and mind had limits. The combat box demanded maximum performance, but even the strongest men eventually broke under the strain. By acknowledging this reality and providing honorable alternatives to combat flying, the Air Force maintained morale and effectiveness. The combat box even influenced aircraft design. The B-17G model, introduced in late 1943, incorporated lessons learned from formation flying. The chin turret was added specifically to address the head-on attack vulnerability. The ammunition feed systems were redesigned to prevent jamming during the extreme maneuvering of formation flying. The oxygen systems were improved to handle the demands of 10-hour missions at altitude. Every modification reflected hard-won knowledge from combat box operations. The formation's influence extended to unexpected areas. Military historians now recognize that the combat box pioneered concepts later formalized in systems theory and network defense. The idea that individual units could create emergent defensive capabilities through proper positioning predated formal military network theory by decades. Modern naval battle groups, with their overlapping defensive systems, trace their conceptual lineage directly to LeMay's combat box. The training programs developed to teach combat box tactics became models for military education. The systematic approach, ground school, flight simulation, progressive difficulty training missions, established patterns still used today. The emphasis on crew coordination over individual skill revolutionized military aviation training philosophy. The modern concept of crew resource management, now standard in both military and civilian aviation, has its roots in the hard lessons learned forming up over England in 1943 and 1944. As the war ended, the full magnitude of what had been accomplished became clear. The United States Army Air Forces had started the war with obsolete tactics, inadequate training, and naive theories about self-defending bombers. Through systematic adaptation, brutal trial and error, and the sacrifice of thousands of young men, they had created the most effective strategic bombing force in history. The combat box had been the key innovation that made daylight precision bombing viable. The final testament to the combat box's effectiveness came from an unexpected source. In 1950, the newly formed U.S. Air Force invited former Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland to lecture at the Air War College.
His presentation focused extensively on the combat box. He stated unequivocally that the formation had been the single most important American tactical innovation of the air war. You defeated us not with courage alone. We had courage too. You defeated us with geometry, discipline, and the systematic application of defensive firepower. The combat box was American genius made manifest. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.